Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I'm a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be discussing using the SRX Setup Wizard JWeb Learning Byte. Alright, so here is our example. In this example, we have SRX1, which is connected to the internet using Gigi 000. Then it connects to the user zone using Gigi 002. Then it connects to the Dmz zone using Gigi 001. And note the prefix we are using there. We are using the 172.29.1.0/24 prefix with the .1 address belonging to the SRX1 and the .100 address belonging to server 1. Then we have the Gigi 002 interface of SRX1, which connects to the user's zone, and that prefix is 10.1.1.0/24. And note that the .1 address belongs to SRX1, and the other devices in that zone do not have an address currently because we will be using DHCP to hand out addresses to those devices. Okay, so now that we have discussed the topology, let's talk about what we want to do. We want to use the JWeb Setup Wizard to do the following. We want to configure basic settings. We want to configure a security topology, which includes the zones, users, and DMZ. We want to set up DHCP server configurations, which will be for the user's zone. And then we'll configure security policies to allow traffic to the internet from the users and the DMZ zone, and then also from the users to the DMZ. But note how there's no policy that will allow traffic from the DMZ to the user zone. And then we'll configure NAT to NAT traffic from the user zone and the DMZ zone to the internet, and then NAT traffic from the internet to the DMZ server. So it's going to be server 1. Let's go ahead and jump to JWeb and get into the setup wizard. Okay, so here is the JWeb for SRX1. And to get started, we need to go to the setup option, which is under the device settings workspace. Now, something I do want to point out here, this is an SRX 340 that I'm using for my internet access, so I'm not actually going to apply these configurations. I'm just going to show you how to do it, and then you can take that from there and use it in your own network. Okay, so we have a few different options. We could edit an existing configuration if we've used this basic setup wizard before, or we could create a new configuration. Here, let's create a new configuration. So to begin, we have a few different options. We have a guided setup, a default setup, and a high availability 2-unit cluster setup. Now, the guided setup is what we're going to focus on today. That's going to allow us to set up those features we talked about in the PowerPoint. The default configuration is really going to set it back to the default configuration that the device shipped with. And of course, the high availability 2-unit cluster setup option is going to allow us to configure a cluster, which we don't need. So we'll stick with the guided setup, which is selected by default. And we're going to have two different options, basic and expert. Now, the difference between those two is you're going to be able to do pretty much the same things. However, the expert option opens up additional options. And so with what we need today, with the criteria that we talked about on the slide, the basic option will work perfectly for what we need. So default, it's selected for basic. Click next. And we need to set up the device information. We'll say SRX-1, the root password, root 123, just something that I would not recommend using as a password because it's a pretty weak password, but for this, it's okay. And then let's add some additional accounts. Click the add button there and add the lab account. This is a pretty standard account for education services. And then we can select the role. Here, let's select super user for the role. Click done, and we have the root account configured, the device name, and an additional user account. Now we need to set up the management interface, which is FXP0. By default, it gives you a 192.168.1.1 address. That's a /24, and that's fine for what we're doing. But of course, I recommend setting this up specifically to your network, your management network, that is. Let's click next. Device time. This will set up NTP, or you could set it manually. That is, the time server option sets up NTP manually, allows you to set it manually. You can select the time zone you want it to be in. We'll just leave it at the default of GMT. And then it gives us a summary of what we are configuring. You can click the edit button on any of these sections. And something else to keep in mind is if you hover your mouse over any of these major sections, it'll list all the major points that you can go to configure. So if you go far into it and realize you need to go back, you can simply hover over one of these main sections and go back to that specific section you need to reconfigure. So let's click next. And now we're getting into the security topology section. And it gives us two options. Is this device going to be connected to the internet or not? With us, yes, it's going to be the internet. It's selected by default. And now we're being asked if this is going to use PPPoE. We're not, so click next. And then the internet zone, it wants us to select the port. We select the respond to ping on interface option if we want to respond to ping packets. Typically you don't on your internet facing interface. And then we can select that we receive a dynamic address or a static address, depending on however your environment is set up. So let's click next. And we're next asked if we want to set up a Dmz zone. And in our case, we do. We have a Dmz zone. So I'll select yes. And what is the address? So we need to enter the network address for the Dmz. Now this is the actual interface address for the interface, not just the network address. And we can enter the network mask, or we can enter the CIDR address. Of course, the CIDR address is a lot easier to enter than entering a bunch of 255s. Then we select the port. And we're going to select port 1, respond to ping, zone services. Yeah, we're going to do some zone services. This is a Dmz zone. Click next. Okay, so which services? We can select web server, mail server, file transfer. We're going to say web server with this, HTTP and HTTPS. Sounds like good protocols to enable. Specify the IP address. And click add, and that'll drop it down to the bottom. So click next. So next, it asks us what our internal network looks like. And the first option has 1 zone, the second option 2 zones, the third option 3 zones. If you need more than 3 zones with this setup wizard, you'll need to select that advanced option. That's an example of an additional option that is available when selecting the advanced setup versus the basic setup. And so with our scenario, we have 2 zones, but keep in mind, we already set up the Dmz zone. So there's no reason to select the 2 zone option. So we'll just select the 1 zone option, and we'll call this zone users instead of internal. And then the network address is going to be 10.1.1.1 for the actual interface that we're going to apply this to. We're going to specify a CIDR of /24, port 2, and enable DHCP server is selected. Now that's important because we are going to be handing out addresses with DHCP to the users. Respond to ping, sure, that sounds great. It's an internal interface, so that's not a big deal. Okay, so now we need to set up the DHCP configuration. And it gives us some options by default, and that's fine. We'll just leave that at the default. We can set the DNS server address to something manual. So this is what we'll hand out with the DHCP requests. And the client pool range, you can see that as well. Click done, and we can review our configuration parameters here. Click next. Okay, now we need to configure the security policy information. First, we're going to start with licenses. You can upload licenses here. I already have licenses added to this device. So we're going to click next. And now we're going to set up the security policies. And what's great about this section is it gives you a graphical representation of what we're doing. And so here we can see that it's internet zone to Dmz zone. It has some suggested policies, or at least one suggested policy, and that's internet to Dmz, action of allow. Yes, we need that. We need access from the internet zone to Dmz. Great. But we also need access from the Dmz zone to the internet. So we can add a security policy. And what we need to do here is see if you can select these boxes to show directionality. And so we don't want bidirectional for this policy. We just want Dmz going to the internet zone. So we'll call this Dmz-inet. Configured protocols, we're just going to allow everything. We can add in some services like web filtering or antivirus. We don't need to do that here. So let's click done. And you can see that we have a second policy now that goes from the Dmz to the internet. Let's click next. Next, it's internet zone and internal zone. And there's already a security policy that is allowing users to access the internet. That's great. Don't need to add anything there. And then the user zone to the Dmz zone. It shows internal zone in the diagram, but we're calling this the user zone. So it shows that in our traffic direction as well, users to Dmz. That's great. We need that as well. Okay, so we do want to jump back. And so let's go back to internal Dmz. One thing I did want to show with the security policy is at the end, we can deny all other traffic or allow all other traffic. And with this, we want to deny all other traffic. There's no reason to allow all other traffic in this scenario. So let's click next. It asks us if we want to set up remote VPN. Now we're good here. We don't need that for this Learning Byte. And here is our configuration summary. We can edit things, of course, if necessary. Let's click next. Now we need to set up NAT. Click next. Okay, so which zones need SourceNet? Well, both zones need to access the internet, so both zones, the users zone and the DMZ zone, need SourceNet. So we'll click next. Okay, so destination net. It's already set up for us because we told it earlier we have servers we want the internet to be able to reach in the DMZ zone. So there's already a rule set up for us saying internet to internal. Now it says internet to internal, and you might raise an eyebrow at this and say, why doesn't this show internet to DMZ? But that is actually what it is describing. It's just referencing the DMZ as an internal zone here. So don't get caught up by that. So everything is good right here. And this is the summary for the NAT configuration. We got the source NAT and destination NAT set up, so we're good there. And that brings us to the end. We can go through the summary. This shows us a summary of everything we did, and we can make changes if we need to. We can select to expand each section to look at it, but we click next to continue on. And now we can apply the settings, or we can say no thanks or return to review. We can return to review if something might be amiss. If it's not, that's fine. We can click apply settings. Now, I'm not going to apply these settings, as I said earlier, because this is actually my SRX 340 I use for internet access, and that would totally mess everything up with what I currently have. We're just going to say no thanks here. It'll ask if we want to clear everything. We'll say yes, and that brings us back to the setup wizard. So that brings us to the end of this Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we demonstrated how to configure the SRX using the JWeb setup wizard. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.